One of the main weapon categories in Starsector is the ballistic type. Ballistic weapons shoot projectiles that often have lower accuracy than energy weapons. However, since ballistic weapons are split between the kinetic and the explosive damage types, you have the chance to deal damage at a higher flux efficiency if you're hitting your shots. Kicking things off, we're going to begin our discussion with autocannons. Autocannons in general provide consistent kinetic damage at a decent range, being able to provide shield pressure without sacrificing too much accuracy. The smallest autocannon available is the light autocannon and the dual light autocannon. Both of these provide reliable DPS at an okay range, and if you had to choose between the light or the dual autocannon, you should consider if you care more about damage or range, since the jump from 600 to 700 range can be important for smaller ships. Meanwhile, if you care most about damage and you expect your ship to reliably get in range, you'll want to go with the dual option because it's 43% more damage compared to the single. Since both of these autocannons have pretty fair trade-offs between each other and provide a decent amount of value, I think the C tier is well suited for them. Moving into the medium slot, we have the heavy autocannon. The heavy autocannon is what I would consider the standard shield break option for the medium ballistic slot. If you're not using a hypervelocity driver for shield break, then you're going to be using the heavy autocannon. Compared to the hypervelocity driver, the autocannon does give up some range, but you have a more flux efficient weapon that's just going to be more consistent at dealing damage. For how well-rounded it is and how commonly I use it, I think the heavy autocannon is deserving of the B tier. And the largest autocannon is going to be the Mark 9, and it does a great job of building off of what the heavy autocannon does right. It has a healthy burst of 4 projectiles, which helps to make up for the lack of accuracy, and the range of 900 matches most other weapons in the large slot. Damage-wise, it matches the Gauss cannon, which we'll talk about later, while being more flux efficient than the Gauss cannon. So if you want a shield break option in the large slot without worrying about flux, this is going to be your go-to weapon. If the large ballistic slot didn't have so many competitive options, I would put the Mark 9 in the A tier. However, it's just too dang competitive out there. I think the B tier is a fair assessment. Moving into the point defense and anti-fighter category, we have the Flak Cannons. The single Flak Cannon on the medium slot is incredibly flux efficient and can take out a variety of missiles in just one hit. And the strength of the Flak Cannon category is that Flak Cannons deal AoE damage, which is ideal for fast-moving fighters or missiles where you want some wiggle room if the shot doesn't exactly make contact with the target. If you upgrade from the single Flak Cannon to the dual Flak Cannon, you'll enjoy more of the same, with there being a DPS boost compared to the single shot. When building your ships, you can use the location of the mount as a way to determine if the dual Flak Cannon or the single Flak Cannon is ideal. If this mount is covering a flank and it's not at the front of a ship, then you're going to want to go with the single Flak Cannon. Otherwise, if it's front and center, feel free to go for the dual version, unless you're short on ordnance points or flux, in which case the single Flak Cannon works just fine. Just know that if you only have a single Flak Cannon, you're going to want some other forms of point defense on your ship if you want to keep your ship safe from most forms of missile and fighter spam. Since Flak Cannons are incredibly efficient and effective, I'm going to be putting both of them in the A tier. What you'll find as you're building low-tech ships is there's an abundance of medium ballistic slots, but you don't have enough flux to be able to put an autocannon or a hypervelocity driver in each slot. But what you can do is put Flak Cannons in your empty slots for flux efficient damage that is going to keep your ship protected from fighters and missiles. Up next, we have the explosive projectile category. The cheapest and most efficient way to deal explosive damage is going to be using the light mortar. It has a flux efficiency of 0.67 per damage, so even if you're hitting shields with your mortars, it's not going to ruin your flux economy. The trade-off for having an explosive option that's this cheap is the light mortar is not the most accurate, and its range is just okay. So you won't be able to reliably hit fighters or smaller targets. I don't think this is a deal breaker though, because for its cost, the light mortar does an adequate job. So let's put it in the C tier. As an upgrade for the medium slot, you have the heavy mortar. Heavy mortars fulfill a similar role to the light mortar. It serves as a cheap and flux-efficient way to deal explosive damage. And since most ships that are dealing damage are going to invest more heavily into their anti-shield weapons, it would make sense that you would use mortars if you don't have the flux to spare. And to be honest, I'm tempted to put the heavy mortars into the B tier, because they provide decent value just like the light mortar. Even just one of these on a smaller ship is going to be enough for armor damage, but the competition in the medium slot is quite high, even higher than the small ballistic slot, I'd say. So to keep things consistent, let's put the heavy mortar in the C tier. What I'd consider to be a straight up upgrade from the heavy mortar is the heavy mauler. The heavy mauler has a range that is only exceeded by this hypervelocity driver and a steady damage output that keeps its flux cost from getting too crazy. Be mindful though that the heavy mauler's high range is going to be most useful on ships that have a decent bonus from the integrated targeting unit hull mod. So if you take a look at most people's builds for cruisers and capital ships, it's very likely you're going to see the heavy mauler being used. The heavy mauler just gets things right. Its high range and steady damage makes it a good pairing for the hypervelocity driver or for larger mounts that also have high range. So I'd put it in the A tier. With the heavy mauler being as good as it is, you'd naturally think that the Hellbore would also be quite good, given that it is very similar to the mauler. But I do not think that this is the case. I'd go as far to say that the heavy mauler undercuts the Hellbore, because you're going to want to use your large ballistic slots for something else, and two heavy maulers can do much of what a single Hellbore can do. Another tragic aspect of the Hellbore is you go from having 3 shots with the heavy mauler to 1 shot with the Hellbore. This means that 1 Hellbore shot every 3 seconds is going to be disproportionately valuable. And that is not what you want with an anti-armor weapon. You want your shots to hit when they need to. The Hellbore also isn't as accurate as something like a Gauss cannon or a hypervelocity driver. So against ships with even a little bit of mobility, you're going to be missing your Hellbores from time to time. You might as well forget about trying to hit frigates too. What I would call shield flickering is very common too. With shield flickering, a ship will raise or lower its shields depending on what's trying to hit it. And since the Hellbore only fires single projectiles, the AI is going to want to raise its shields to absorb that hit. And it's way easier to do this against single projectiles compared to bursts of projectiles. The strength of the other options in the large ballistic slot isn't doing the Hellbore any favors either. So for the Hellbore, let's place it in the C tier. For ballistic weapons, there are also 2 oddballs, if you want to call them that. They're generally effective and don't really specialize in dealing damage to shields or to armor. The first one of this type in the medium slot is the Thumper. The Thumper falls into the general role since it trades on a 1-to-1 basis with shields and armor, dealing fragmentation damage as it goes. Since fragmentation damage deals 100% damage to hull, Thumper shines in providing 4 damage per flux spent on hulls, which is one of the most efficient damage trades in the game. The difficulty with that though is using a Thumper is best left to the player's control, since there are a lot of situations where you wouldn't want to be shooting the Thumper. For instance, if an enemy has all their armor intact, you wouldn't want to trade 1 flux for 1 damage, because you'll most likely be hitting armor or shields. And in a close fight, a 1-to-1 trade like this one isn't going to be a good setup, because you can bet that the enemy ship is going to have some kind of kinetic damage that's trading at a much better ratio. Taking a step back though, Thumpers are pretty darn good at taking out fighters. It's accurate enough to hit medium or large fighters, and since it deals fragmentation damage like a lot of point defense turrets, it can power through the whole HP on fighters pretty darn quickly. You could technically pair it with expanded mags too for pumping out damage. You just have to make sure that the ship you're putting it on has enough flux to keep those Thumpers in operation. If Flak Cannons didn't exist, then I could see the Thumper being B tier potentially. But I think ultimately the Thumper falls victim to the efficacy of other medium ballistic options. So I'm going to put it in the C tier. And if there's any ballistic weapon that ought to receive extra attention for its uniqueness, then the Mjolnir cannon definitely deserves it. While the Mjolnir cannon does require a good deal of flux to operate, it deals energy damage, which doesn't have a damage penalty against armor or shields, and it deals EMP damage, which is hard to come by in the ballistics category. Generally with Mjolnir, I'm trying to get it onto a ship so badly. I want to be able to use it, but the flux cost is so expensive. And you start to look into other ways to get EMP damage, like sabos or pilums or hypervelocity drivers, rather than using Mjolnir for that. Nevertheless, it is still the most well-rounded, large ballistic weapon available, and the EMP damage is just gravy on top of that. So for what it's worth, I'd still put the Mjolnir in the B tier, since it's a cut above the rest. With those general weapons out of the way, we get into precision kinetic weapons. These are going to be weapons that fire at usually a long range in a single shot fashion and deal kinetic damage. The precursor to larger weapons in this category is the railgun. Shooting individual projectiles with a brief delay in between, the railgun can land shots at a fair distance away without needing to reload like the Needler does. And if it weren't for this one thing, the railgun would be going in the B tier. And here's that one thing. Unlike many of the other precision kinetic weapons available in larger slots, the railgun doesn't fire at a longer range than other small ballistic options. Its range isn't bad, but in my opinion, that lack of range compared to the other options means the railgun fails to set itself apart, making it a decent weapon overall, fitting for the C tier. Moving along, you may be wondering why I didn't discuss the Arbalist autocannon during the section dedicated to autocannons specifically. That's because, unlike other autocannons, the Arbalist shoots in a single shot fashion which resembles precision weapons. However, the Arbalist doesn't have the accuracy of precision weapons, so it's a middle ground option. Like other middle ground options though, you'll find the Arbalist is quite lacking upon closer inspection, taking up more ordnance points than the dual autocannon and the railgun, meanwhile not offering much of an improvement over those two weapons. You also have the same problem faced by the Hellbore, because if you have a low accuracy weapon that's only firing single shots, you're going to be missing a lot of them. So overall, I find the Arbalist to be one of the more lackluster options, all things considered, deserving of the D tier. In stark contrast to the Arbalist autocannon, we have the single-shot hypervelocity driver. Compared to the railgun in the small slot, the hypervelocity driver has two distinct upgrades. First, its range is the highest among medium ballistic mounts, and second, its rounds have the added benefit of dealing EMP damage. These two traits combined together make the hypervelocity driver exceptionally useful for applying shield pressure at range. And if the enemy does drop their shields, they'll have to deal with that EMP damage. I'd go as far to say that the hypervelocity driver is one of the most used ballistic weapons, with it having a place on certain frigates all the way up to the largest capital ships. Just be mindful of the flux cost, and if you keep that in check, many ships are going to be able to benefit from at least one hypervelocity driver. Touching again on the EMP damage, this is doubly useful on a kinetic ballistic weapon, because the issue with anti-shield weapons is if you're hitting armor, you're doing half damage with kinetic weapons. But if you're dealing EMP damage, that means hitting armor with this kind of weapon turns out to be a good thing. So you're in a win-win situation. Also, EMP damage is harder to come by in the ballistics category. So a lot of ships are going to lean into using the hypervelocity driver just to get that EMP damage. That all being said, I think it's fair to say we have our first S tier contender. Let's go ahead and put it up there. And now we have the Gauss cannon, the juiced up hypervelocity driver, if you will. At the end of the day, the Gauss cannon is the pinnacle of precision weaponry in Starsector. You have a 700 damage kinetic shot that fires every 2 seconds, and it has a staggering range of 1200. With that kind of range, if you have integrated targeting unit and a pilot with range buffs, you're almost going to be able to shoot across the entire screen in a battle. While the Gauss cannon is not flux efficient, its main draw is not efficiency, accuracy, or even damage for that matter, but instead its usefulness in shooting enemies before they get in range with their own guns. And with integrated targeting unit and other perks, you can bully even other capital ships if you have a Gauss cannon on your own capital. The two things that stop me from giving the Gauss cannon a glowing review are it gives up EMP damage, which its predecessor, the hypervelocity driver, has, and the single shot fire rate is a risk factor against smaller ships who may just decide to avoid the projectiles. And at that point, the Gauss cannon would have a similar problem compared to the Hellbore cannon, which I've already put in the C tier. But the Gauss cannon has more range than the Hellbore, and anti-shield damage is generally more important than anti-armor damage. So I give the Gauss cannon a firm position in the B tier. I've dubbed the next category automatic point defense weapon because there are a handful of smaller, usually, point defense mounts which are automatic and possess a fair amount of accuracy. So let's cover them real quick. The first is the Vulcan cannon. The Vulcan cannon ends up being the default small slot option if you're out of flux and you want to use up a ship's remaining mounts. That's because it requires hardly any flux to run, and it provides useful protection against missiles. Because of how cheap it is at 4 ordnance points, and how absurdly flux efficient it is, I would not venture to hate on the Vulcan cannon. I think it's great at what it does, and there's a reason why it's considered to be the default small ballistic slot when you're filling out a ship. So let's put it in its rightful place in the B tier. For the light machine gun and the dual light machine gun, you have slightly more range on both of these compared to the Vulcan, and you deal kinetic damage instead of fragmentation damage. What this translates to is the Vulcan is better against missiles generally compared to the light machine gun. Meanwhile, the light machine gun is going to be better at taking down shielded fighters or applying shield pressure close range. In short, you could think of it as if you had to choose, you would put Vulcans on the back of your ship and then light machine guns at the front of your ship. That's if you're not short on flux though, and generally you are, so you end up going with Vulcans anyway. But there's nothing wrong with the light machine gun or the dual light machine gun. They're both good. To differentiate between the light machine gun and the dual version, the dual variant costs 2 more ordnance points than the single. So for that, it's just a question of, do you want to spend 2 extra ordnance points for more damage? Personally, I like to put the dual light machine gun on the front of certain ships to add extra kinetic pressure if I know they're going to be getting up close. But the cost of the single version is quite appealing. It's totally understandable. So let's go ahead and put both of them in the B tier as well. For the heavy machine gun, it's a similar story. You get a flux efficient source of extra kinetic damage and decent protection against missiles and fighters. The only thing holding the heavy machine gun back is that you're usually going to go with Flak Cannons if you have a medium ballistic slot open for point defense. But if you need extra kinetic damage, the heavy machine gun is a great way to get it because unlike smaller point defense mounts, you get a reasonable range of 450 with the heavy machine gun. It's not a long range by any stretch of the imagination. But from a practical perspective, smaller ships like frigates and destroyers will be able to get within 450 range of other ships, at which point this heavy machine gun is going to apply a good amount of kinetic pressure while serving as point defense mount. So I'm going to go ahead and put the heavy machine gun in the B tier as well. Alright, let's talk Needlers. Needlers are a unique type of kinetic weapon that deals burst damage, one of the few forms of burst damage in the ballistic category. The way that they deal burst damage in a clip is similar to thumpers. Each Needler mount has a magazine that will need to replenish over time to reload it after you fire each volley. With the light Needler, a substantial amount of shield damage is applied in 15-round bursts until the Needler's ammo is depleted. Because each burst of rounds is delivered quickly, this allows for a ship to exit the effective range of enemy weapons and then return after reloading the Needlers. With this kind of utility, you'll often see phase ships use light Needlers, reload while phasing, and then return after the reload time is ended. Despite having a reasonable amount of accuracy, you won't want to rely on the Needler for point defense though, like you would a Thumper, because its limited ammo is going to need to be saved for shield pressure specifically. On a more personal note, I'd say that I've grown to like the Light Needler more and more, because if there's anything low-tech ships have a lot of, it's usually small ballistic mounts. And with Light Needlers, even just 2 or 3 of them, you can apply a respectable amount of shield pressure and open up opportunities for your anti-armor ballistic weapons or your missiles to land hits on the enemy's hull. And one thing that will be true for weapons in the Needler category, as well as, again, I'll mention the Thumper, if you have the expanded magazines hull mod, your damage potential with Needlers is going to go through the roof. So you'd perhaps consider them on ships that already have expanded magazines, or ships that you're using to rush down enemies and secure kills quickly. And not to spoil things, I think the Light Needler is the strongest in its category here. So I'm going to put it in A tier. A step past the Light Needler is the Heavy Needler, and due to a variety of factors, it ends up being less impressive than the Light Needler. For one, there are a lot of cases where it would be more practical to have 2 Light Needlers instead of 1 Heavy Needler, because the medium slot that Heavy Needler would take up would be better used by something like a Flak Cannon or a hypervelocity driver. Small mounts are also usually right at the front of the ship, and that's where you want your Needlers, because they do have a below average range. Heavy Needlers also run into flux issues on anything smaller than a cruiser, I'd say. For a lot of ships, if they do have a Heavy Needler, they're going to want to either phase out or retreat, reload it, then come back, because they're going to use so much flux firing the weapon. But having a ballistic slot free for the Heavy Needler generally means you're not going to be fast enough for that playstyle. And even if you were fast enough with a medium slot, again, you'd probably want to put something else in the medium mount and then use Light Needlers instead in smaller mounts. And even though it doesn't provide as much kinetic damage, you do have to think about the flux efficiency of the heavy machine gun in a medium slot. That heavy machine gun is going to have your back against missiles and fighters, and if you get close enough, like you would be with a Needler build, you'll be doing a fair amount of kinetic damage without elevating your flux levels. Anyway, suffice it to say, I think the Heavy Needler is alright. Certainly not a bad weapon. So let's go ahead and put it in the C tier. And even though the Storm Needler is essentially it's a substantial upgrade from the Heavy Needler, it finds itself in an odd spot because it has great damage output and flux efficiency, but the flux cost and the ordnance point cost is very high, and you're operating at an effective range of 700, which is below average. Bottom line is, you do not want your anti-shield damage to be at a lower range, because what will happen is, the way the AI works, your ship is going to fire weapons at their effective range, provided there's enough flux to do so. If your anti-shield damage has lower range than your anti-armor range, that means your anti-armor shots are going to hit first, which is no bueno, because at the start of an engagement, an enemy most certainly is going to have their shields up and ready to go. So any anti-armor damage you're doing is going to be flux inefficient, putting you at a disadvantage for that engagement. So let's ask ourselves this question: what anti-armor weapon is going to fire at a range of 700 or less? And the answer to that is there aren't many. You'll have the assault gun, we'll talk about in a moment, and mortar options, which, that, to be fair, mortars are not bad, and you're going to be using a lot of flux with the Storm Needler, so I could see mortars working quite well with it. But even still, having a large ballistic weapon fire at a range of 700, you're giving up one of the major strengths of the large slot, that being putting on integrated targeting unit on a cruiser or a capital ship, having a range then of 900 or 1200 with the Gauss cannon, and then being able to compete with other low-tech ships that have their own ballistic weapons, or remnants or high-tech ships which are using energy weapons that have a lot of range. So to put it simply, the Storm Needler is suited for a ship that's going to rush down the enemy, but ships with large ballistic mounts usually aren't the type to be rushing down other enemies. All that being said, it's still a very fun weapon. You can put it on something like a Retribution or a Manticore and dish out just tons and tons of damage. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the C tier. The final category we're going to be discussing is the assault gun category. I'd consider these to be weapons that have an automatic rate of fire and deal explosive damage. So excellent against armor. The first is the light assault gun. It's going to be the best option for stripping armor in the small slot. Its flux efficiency is okay, but due to its higher than average DPS, you might have trouble using it on smaller ships like frigates, which have a lower flux dissipation. However, on destroyers and cruisers, there are a lot of cases where the light assault gun is a solid option. Its accuracy is good enough to shoot down all but the fastest ship, so no complaints there. And you could even say it's a half-decent source of point defense, albeit at a higher flux cost compared to other small mounts. It's not great, but not bad. Well balanced. Let's put it in the C tier then. The assault chain gun is interesting because it's related to the light assault gun, but it operates very, very differently. So the chain gun fulfills the close range niche, and it fills that niche quite well. The goal with it is simple. You charge in, turn the enemy's armor into HGs, and then either get out or finish the job. Simple as that. With the high flux cost and short range, this weapon is a favorite for safety overrides builds on low-tech ships, since the increased speed makes it possible to quickly close the distance, unload the chain gun, and then take your leave. And I may be personally biased in favor of this weapon because one of the first frigates I had success piloting on my own was the Luddic Path Brawler with 2 chain guns and 2 sabos. With that little thing, I could fly around the map with ease and take down ships 4 or 5 times bigger, and it felt amazing. So even though the assault chain gun is niche, it fills that niche so well that I think it is deserving of the B tier. The largest assault gun is the Hephaestus. Despite the Hephaestus having the second highest damage output in the ballistics category, I think it suffers from not having a clear niche. Its automatic rate of fire would be paired best with anti-shield weapons so that the anti-shield and the anti-armor damage can be blended together. But there isn't a well-suited counterpart for the Hephaestus, as the heavy autocannon Mark 9 Gauss and the hypervelocity driver fire in either single shots or bursts instead of providing automatic fire. In fact, the only automatic anti-shield weapons are going to be at a lower range than the Hephaestus, and that is an awkward setup. To elaborate further, anti-shield weapons are generally going to either fire at a long range or in bursts at a short range. This creates 2 distinct categories. You have burst damage up close that you would use when you are advancing on another ship, or something like the Gauss or the hypervelocity driver where you can apply pressure at range. The Hephaestus fails to synergize with either of these archetypes. And what's puzzling about this is the precursor to the Hephaestus is the chain assault gun, and that weapon understands this idea. That's why its range is at 450, being much shorter than average. The Hephaestus all the while doubles the range of the chain assault gun, so it loses its close range niche, and in doing so, it outranges much of the anti-shield category. When trading shots or advancing on an enemy ship, you want your anti-shield weapons firing first. But the Hephaestus' range of 900 ensures it's going to be firing pretty early in an engagement. That's going to be when an enemy's shields are still active. So you're going to be trading flux inefficiently right out of the gate. In later game combat, this is unacceptable. You cannot be trading flux inefficiently in the late game, especially at a range of 900. Alright, so let's shift gears. Let's say that you'd be putting a Hephaestus on a ship so that it's able to quickly eliminate smaller ships. So less so about winning 1v1s against comparable ships and more about improving the time to kill against smaller ships. There are 2 big problems with that. The first one is you shouldn't be using your larger ships, so capital ships. You shouldn't be using them to chase down smaller ships. That should not be their main purpose. If you wanted a ship that specialized in chasing down smaller ships, there are destroyers and cruisers that can do it much more efficiently and at a lower deployment point cost. But aside from a few exceptions, there aren't many cruisers or destroyers that have the flux capacity for a Hephaestus. So you're in a bind there. On top of that, if your goal is to do anti-armor damage quickly, the Hephaestus is not the best way to do that. First off, it requires a sizable amount of flux. Second of all, the best way to deal burst damage against armor is using missiles, and there are lots of fantastic missile options for this purpose. You'll see capital ships using things like Mervs, Locusts, Cyclone Reapers, Hammers, hell, even Dagger Bombers. There are so many different ways to effectively deal armor damage at range. Why would I use a 900 range option for this? It doesn't make much sense. And then if you're mounting Hephaestus, that means you're giving up a Mark 9, you're giving up a Mjolnir, you're giving up a Gauss. For most ships, that's too painful of a trade-off. And the cruel irony with the Hephaestus is I'd be more likely to use it if its range was lower. Because the way the AI operates weapons in Starsector, you really want your anti-shield weapons to have a longer range than your anti-armor weapons. That's why the hypervelocity driver outranges the heavy mauler. That's why the Gauss cannon outranges everything else. You want your anti-shield damage up front. But if you have a Hephaestus firing anti-armor rounds at 900 range, it's like being weighed down by a boat anchor the whole battle until the enemy runs out of shields, in which case the Hephaestus becomes useful. So all things considered, I'm going to put it in the D tier, because if you played Starsector and never used a Hephaestus, you'd be in good shape. Even argue you'd probably be in better shape than players who have tried to make it work. Before we take a look at what the final result here, let's find a home for the Devastator cannon. It would be fair to say that the Devastator functions like a Flak Cannon that has extended range. And notably, the Devastator fires explosive rounds rather than fragmentation rounds. So it doubles as an anti-armor option in addition to being able to mow through missile spam or fighter spam. With these things in mind, it probably comes as no surprise, but I think the Devastator is deserving of the A tier. It's just a very versatile option for larger ships looking to deal a lot of damage and handle smaller craft that might get close. And I do want to take a look at this here and see if there are any changes that I would make. Just like with the missiles tier list, I have to say I'm impressed at how balanced Starsector is, because the gap between each tier is quite narrow, and it's difficult to rank each of these weapons because they are overall balanced. The hypervelocity driver is the only one that made it to the S tier, but that's not because you should be putting the hypervelocity driver in every single slot. It's because the driver is going to be used very often in ship builds, and the driver has a disproportionate amount of influence over the rankings of all the other weapons. Because what keeps the Mjolnir out of the A tier? Well, the driver is a more flux effective way to get EMP damage. What's keeping the Gauss cannon out of the A tier? Well, for a lot of ships that are short on their flux budget, they'll probably be using a hypervelocity driver instead of the Gauss cannon. And we can see that trickle-down effect in the A tier too. Why isn't the Thumper in the B tier? Well, that's because there are Flak Cannons. Flak Cannons are usually going to be used instead of the Thumper. Why isn't the Hellbore or the Hephaestus ranked higher? Well, the Heavy Mauler is so effective for so many ships that I don't really have a need for the Hellbore or the Hephaestus. I will say this though, I don't think it's fair to have the Hephaestus in the same tier as the Arbalest. Yeah, there's certainly some builds, especially if they're player controlled, that could take advantage of the Hephaestus. So if I could change one thing about these rankings, I'd move the Hephaestus up to the C tier. The Arbalest would stay in D tier though. I have a hard time imagining why on earth I'd be using an Arbalest. And on a final note, right now much of my time in Starsector is experimenting with builds that can succeed in the late game. So I tend to value flux efficiency quite highly, and that's probably why it was so hard on the Hephaestus, because I don't see a clear use for it. It's a general purpose anti-armor weapon, but if you were to have a weapon that was general purpose, you wouldn't want it to be an anti-armor weapon. You'd want it to be kinetic, because kinetic damage is far more useful in general compared to anti-armor damage. That's all I have to say about that. If you're interested in checking out the missiles tier list that I made, I'll go ahead and link that here. And if you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments or drop a sub. I'll see you next time.